Chapter 17. Düsseldorf. In the autumn of 1833, Felix signed a contract with immense satisfaction. He folded it carefully into a letter for a servant to send. It was off to Düsseldorf. Felix accepted the terms of a 3-year engagement, a salary of $600 per annum, and 3 months' leave of absence. Abraham deemed it a decent move, and wasn't long before Felix made his official residence in Düsseldorf. It was like a fresh breath of air when the carriage parked at a street side, where an old spacious home sat. It was owned by a friend who was renting out rooms. "Herr Shadow," Felix called to a man coming towards the home. "Felix, you've made it," Herr Shadow waved. He was the landlord and a patron concerning fine arts. As a painter himself, Shadow helped revive the Academy of Düsseldorf. Felix followed him into the colonial house. The inside had a most Regency feel and decor. Herr Shadow explained, "I have rooms on the ground floor for you. I hope you find my terms favorable." "I did," Felix assured, handing him the down payment. Shadow pocketed the money and suggested, "How about later you sit in for a sketch? It would be nice to chat as I practice drawing." "Sure," Felix headed into his new abide. Shadow left him to settle. As Felix roamed the main living area, the first thing he noticed was a nice grand piano set up for him. He tapped a few of the freshly tuned keys. Also in the main room was a sofa, coffee table, and fireplace. A separate section near the living area contained a stove and a round dining table. Lastly, a bedroom was tucked away further into the abide. In the moment he felt hope with this new life. His thoughts were interrupted as the sound of an old rusty upright piano vibrated through an interior wall. He had a neighbor. Felix observed the music. They were playing Rossini's airs desperately slow. After a day or so he found that his neighbor was a lady. He memorized her piano routine. 2 hours at the keys, playing the same pieces along with the same mistakes. Upon hearing the first chord, Felix knew each piece by heart. Yet the lady was more likely tormented as Felix played piano at all hours. Shadow soon knocked at the door, bringing his sketching supplies and a stack of papers. Felix turned around while at the piano as he entered. Shadow set the stack of papers on the piano's lid, explaining, "There is some work for you before your first meeting with the orchestra. There is a score that has not yet been copied, and a few other scores that need deciding if deemed ready for a performance." "All right," Felix shuffled through the seemingly endless pile of manuscripts. Shadow took his pencil and sketchbook. "First, though, I must make a good sketch of you." "Of course," Felix posed while sitting at the keys. Shadow began the outlines of a portrait. They had a good chat, but Felix's mind pondered over the large amount of work before him. He felt relieved when the portrait finished. The next Monday brought the first day of Felix's new position. After a good night's rest and a refined outfit to wear, Felix headed to the academy with Chateau in all freshness. Contrary to the good start, the day was soon to turn into a typical Monday. The orchestra trudged in, tired from the occasional weekends off. When the musicians seated in the large rehearsal room, Chateau announced, "I have good news today. You have a new director." He gestured to Felix to step forward. Slight grumbles passed around. It was the same trouble as during the festival last spring. Felix hoped such things wouldn't interfere with his duties. Despite the muttering, Felix stepped forward before the orchestra at the conducting desk. "As you all know, my name is Felix. I shall do my best to bring out your best in the music that shall be presented to the public." He glanced at the musicians as they sat in silence, holding their instruments. Most listened commonly, but a few gave a dirty glance at their new director. After initial greetings, Felix gestured them to the music. They lifted their instruments in obedience. When he counted them in, the sound was dry and rusty. Felix determined that they had potential and could get them decent in the upcoming weeks. After running some short pieces, rehearsals ended. Shadow informed Felix as he packed up, "I have received notice that the Crown Prince Frederick is in Düsseldorf. He wants you and I to dinner." "I'll be ready to go in a second." Felix put the scores in his satchel. The both of them took a carriage back to Chateau's home so they could dress properly for the occasion. At the hour of dinner, they arrived at the prince's grand accommodation. They were welcomed to the large dining hall where a plethora of guests were seated. A servant showed Chateau to a seat. The last open chair stood nearest to the foot of the table, beside the host. Prince Frederick gestured Felix to come. Felix obeyed, sitting beside the prince and another acquaintance, the poet Herr Immermann. He worked with the Theatre Society of Düsseldorf. After being welcomed, Prince Frederick spoke straight away. My dear Mendelssohn, I'm so glad that you found settlement here in Germany. I was so upset as you were everywhere but here in the last few years. I've not caught a concert in a while. How is your time here so far? It's well. I think the orchestra will be decent in due time. Felix eyed the rather large platter at the table center, holding a ridiculous amount of Cornish hens. You mean they are not decent right now? Shadow questioned. Felix stated as the servants served each guest a miniature hen. They are a bit rusty, but it will be sufficient after a few rehearsals. I inquire, Immerman butted in, that you should join the theater society. I'd like some operas conducted. Older ones. I know you like reviving classical works. I would be delighted. Felix set a napkin on his lap as a nicely roasted hen was placed before him. Immerman's idea correlated with Felix's intentions, to bring back the works of Mozart, Beethoven, and obscure composers. It was questionable how the public would react. With that, everyone began eating and speaking in all casualness. A few weeks into the position of director, Felix became near to drowning in work. The complex schedule limited his time for leisure and composition. If he didn't have a pen in his hand, he was either conducting or in a meeting with various committees. There were many groups such as the Theater Society, Choral Society, Orchestra, and Church. The Theater Society with Immerman took a large chunk of time. They held meetings concerning the improvement of the stage. It was decided to join the theater and the orchestra together to prepare classical operas that hadn't seen the public eye in years. It was a different concept, as audiences were always craving something new, not old. Though Felix wasn't successful at composing opera, he could contribute to the stage by organizing them. Felix began feeling comfortable working with the orchestra when the musicians cooperated. Besides the plans of opera, much sacred music had been commissioned by the church. The rehearsals of sacred music gave way to the most struggle in the attitudes of the musicians. Some decided it better to murmur about Felix conducting rather than concentrate on the music. They couldn't get past their opinions of Felix's family background. As the mutterings became apparent over the music, Felix glared at the one speaking while conducting. He wasn't going to stop the music for such insolence, but the whole orchestra messed up a section of triplets. Again. Felix hit his baton against the stand, this time angry. Every time you play the triplets wrong. For the millionth time, a triplet is not a quaver and two semiquavers. It's a strict 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. He patted the rhythm on his leg. Not 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Felix's face turned a slight red. Before trying again, an older hornist chuckled. Don't get too much of a temper tantrum over it. Shut up, Felix hissed as the others snickered along. The older men viewed him as a child, and Felix couldn't stand such. He scolded them. I have been respectful to you, so you should respect my directing. I am your director, not a child. Since you're our director, when are you organizing our pay? A younger violinist questioned. I'll get to that soon. First, let's finish this rehearsal. Felix flipped a few pages in his score. The musicians listened for the last few minutes. It was the only calm moment in the entire day. After correcting some things, he stated, I will get contracts organized this week for your pay. Otherwise, we are done today. Eagerly, the musicians began packing up their instruments. Somewhat. Another horrifying thing about this group was the care of their instruments. The violinists merely carried their fiddles about, only covering them with their coats when a rain fell. It affected sound quality. The only careful ones were the trombonists and percussionists. The rest were ignorant and rather abominable in sound. Felix gathered his scores, not wanting to deal with their antics in the moment. Outside the academy, Immerman caught up with Felix. The sight of the poet tired Felix. With all of the trouble dealing with the Philharmonic, Immerman wanted him to do more for the theater. Are you free tomorrow? There is a rehearsal with a few singers for Don Juan. I'd be pleased if you conducted rehearsals. You know I have my duties with the orchestra for sacred music right now. This will be after orchestra rehearsals. I have other obligations. Tomorrow I must organize contracts to pay the musicians. You know you agreed to be part of the theater society, right? Act like it. Immerman stormed off in irritation. Felix called out to him, explaining, I need rest and time of my own. Besides, when things get put together with everyone, I'll be conducting those rehearsals. And those rehearsals shall be twice as long. Immerman pressured from afar. Felix gave a small sigh and walked to a carriage to get back home. Upon arriving back to Shadow's comfortable home, Felix felt a little relief. Before he got to his rooms, Shadow stood in the main hall, gazing out the window in his usual way. Rehearsals went well? He asked as if he had eyes in the back of his head. It wasn't the greatest. We ran the church's commissions. Tomorrow I give the musicians their contracts. Felix in honesty was nervous concerning the payment terms. There were 2 contracts for each musician on their salary, in which they would have to agree. Shadow kindly reminded, "Remember that the committee has a price fix, and you must be sure you're making enough for my rent. Be careful how kind you are to them. I tell you, as you are young and may give way to their begs. Be stern." "I've calculated the wages. It's figured out." Felix ended the conversation in haste by walking to his rooms. As soon as shutting the door, setting his bag down, and flopping into bed, he vented to his overwhelmed state with tears. The anxiety of the day's events got to him. The mutterings of the musicians, the long, frustrating rehearsal, the demands of Immerman and organizing payments, it all made his feelings poor. Holding in his inner anxiousness caused a great deal of headache. He began to wonder if he were biting off more than he could chew. The job he thought to be a dream come true was faring differently, yet to his dismay it was only going to get harder. The next day the contracts were ready for the musicians. Felix sorted them in the early hours. By the afternoon he brought the stack of papers to his conducting desk. All of the members of the orchestra crowded around to take their copies. In eagerness they grabbed them, until they looked at the fine print. "What sort of trick is this?" a middle-aged violinist hissed at Felix. A trombonist exclaimed at his paper, "Such robbery! I have a family to feed." Felix stood at his desk in a sigh in the midst of groans and complaints, festering all around him. Begging and bartering came next, snapping over $1 more or less. The negotiating reminded Felix of his father's little proverb, asking and bidding make the sale. Felix complied with suggestions using common sense until everyone came to an agreement. Somewhat. Most still thought the pay was insufficient, but signed their papers otherwise. Everyone then dispersed for the day, as Felix planned a long rehearsal for the next. While walking outside the academy, Immerman caught sight of Felix entering a carriage. He felt offended that Felix cut orchestra rehearsal short to go home, when he could be helping the theater. Immerman rushed inside the academy to find the nearest place to pen a letter. Meanwhile, Felix felt ever so happy to be home early. He used his time to compose, in relaxation, sprawled out on the sofa in comfortable lounging attire with the fireplace crackling. To top it off, he poured himself a healthy glass of red wine, a small plate of sliced clementines, and dark chocolate accompanied. With his score and pen at hand, he sketched his latest idea. An oratorio for orchestra and voices struck his muse. Oratorios were typically based on religious texts or themes. Examples include Bach's St. Matthew Passion and Handel's Messiah. Felix decided to title his St. Paul and base the music on the chosen texts. Though it was common to consult a church head to help organize the text, Felix preferred doing his own research. He consulted a pastor when he felt it necessary, in hopes the oratorio would be done by the time another music festival came around. Shadow lightly knocked at the door and came in to find Felix in his most comfortable leisure time. He handed Felix a letter. "It's from Herr Immerman." "Oh." Felix opened it. He tossed it aside after skimming it. It was a long paragraph ranting at Felix for not coming to the theater. Shadow glanced at the note. "Are you not going to reply?" "Not right now. I am devoting the rest of the day to self-care." He set his music aside and stretched out on the couch. "Right now, I nap. After that, I shall have a warm bubble bath, whilst dining on fresh cherries. Then, for supper, I shall have more wine and a hearty pasta." "Well, la-ti-da-da." Shadow stole some chocolate as Felix shut his eyes. He left to let Felix enjoy his pampering day. As Shadow continued work of his own, Felix's plans began to influence Shadow. He decided to make a nice dinner for himself and taste a bit of whiskey. The next morning, Felix stood at his conducting desk, refreshed and ready for a long rehearsal. There was one small problem. Every orchestra chair stood empty upon the hour. Felix practiced conducting in his lonesome for a bit, but then put his arm down in disappointment. A sigh escaped his mouth. Suddenly, a middle-aged woman came into the auditorium and met Felix at the stage. She wore a refined dark green dress. A feathered navy blue hat covered her pinned black hair. The choice of dark clothing and her rich demeanor gave a rather scary essence. "Herr Mendelssohn?" the woman asked poshly. Her tone indicated he was to be scolded. Felix turned to her. "Yeah?" "Excuse me, but I must speak with you. as you are the director of the orchestra in which my talented nephew is part of. He is the flautist that sits there usually." She pointed to the center front chair. Felix grumbled within himself. The man that sat there was one of the most wretched of performers. This aunt of his deemed just as wretched. She continued on, "My nephew's talents are worth a good pay. A good pay, I tell you. I believe you have miscalculated his monthly worth." "I am sorry, madame. I've stated my terms and the papers are signed." Felix grabbed the stack of contracts. The lady sneered, putting her hands on her hips. "Do you have any compassion? My nephew deserves more." "I have to live too." Felix shielded himself with the stack of papers as the woman stormed towards him. She unexpectedly snatched his conducting baton from the music stand. Felix in an instant dropped the contracts and covered his head as she started hitting him. When he managed to pry it from her hands, she hissed, "I'll be back if you don't change your terms." She wistfully turned away. Felix cleaned up the mess of contracts scattered about. While picking up the last few papers, someone walked up beside him, kindly tapping the shoulder. Felix jumped, thinking it to be the aunt, but looked up to see much more of a gentle woman. Her tone was soft. "Felix, I am sorry to have startled you, but I must speak with you." "Go ahead," Felix inquired, standing up. The reserved woman burst into tears while holding him at the shoulders. She begged in utter dramatic sorrow. "Please, please, my husband needs to provide for our family. I have a child that needs food. Please give him the pay to help us. Please." She sobbed into his chest, hugging him. It caused Felix to drop all of the contracts again. He looked up to the ceiling with a sigh as the woman wouldn't let go of him. "I am sorry. The pay I gave is sufficient. The contracts are signed." Felix then noticed a few orchestra members peeking into the auditorium at the side of the stage. There were 3 of them. Felix sighed. "I know you have something to say, so just tell me now." "We are hungry. Our children need food. I have high rent," they each pleaded, so utterly beneath contempt. Felix face-palmed. The woman still cried on his shoulder. He gently stepped away to pick up the contracts once more, this time setting them down on the music desk. The musicians waited for an answer. Felix stated, "You signed already. You have sufficient means for a living. Stop trying to get more. This conversation is done." Felix turned to his desk. The 3 musicians went away humbly, but showing a miserable expression. The wife wept in her hands when walking away. Over the course of an hour, many others came to bargain and haggle. Out of 30 people, only a trombonist stated, "I am satisfied." The whole ordeal took 4 days to convince the orchestra back into their usual routine. Felix wasn't the only director struggling with the musicians of Düsseldorf. It so happened that Julius Rietz, the younger brother of Edward Rietz, directed the choral society. Felix knew him well, as Julius had a part in copying the Bach oratorio for him those years ago. The chorus of Düsseldorf consisted of 120 singers, yet it was more like 120 drunks. In one rehearsal room, they sang, but came to rehearsal after drinking and antics. Their energy was at the maximum when the sessions were to begin. Julius wasn't an authoritative man and did his best to get them singing, but they often shouted at him. At times, Julius requested Felix to rehearsals. The choir never looked forward to such days, especially when his music was to be sung. Felix had an authoritative attitude when necessary, and took his music, especially sacred works, in all seriousness. When he arrived at the hour, only Julius occupied the rehearsal room. The chorus was late. Felix took a chair and spoke to Julius as they waited. Soon, outside the door, voices echoed in song. "Flim flashin' a beer on divan, flim flashin' a beer." "Oh dear," Julius sighed. Felix stood from the chair. "This ought to be fun, as it seems they have already gone through 95 bottles." He stood sternly as the singers entered and cheered. Their joy halted when noticing Felix with his arms crossed. Glaring at each of them, they silently took their seats in shame. Once everyone settled, Felix took his seat behind Julius, who was set to conduct. Everything surprisingly started out great. The singers obeyed and sang as they were supposed to. Yet when one found some sort of fault in the music and refused to go on, things went downhill. "I refuse to sing that high," a tenor shouted at Julius in the midst of the music. Felix looked up in pure anger, looking to see who made such a comment. As the others sang on, a soprano hissed, "This part is stupid." Felix started up from his seat and stormed closer to the choir. glaring at the ones causing trouble. Julius kept conducting, as some still sang. An insolent young man in the front, who had much to drink, grabbed a bottle of champagne hidden in his coat. He popped it open as Felix walked by. The cork flung in the air, and fizz sprayed all over Felix's pants. In an uproar, everyone laughed, drunkenly. The young man snickered at Felix. "I believe you've wet yourself." "Shut up, give me that champagne now." Felix snatched the bottle and threw it against the wall, breaking it. The laughter ceased, and the room filled with a shouting match. Felix scolded them in all fury like boots at an inn. "Now you had better listen," Felix scorned. "There is to be a concert in a few days. I want no more drinking or screwing around. You are all adults." "We can do what we want since we are adults," a tenor snapped back. Others yelled, giving their opinions. The shouts gave a new anxiety. Felix never had such a hash with performers. Finally, when the arguments ceased, they managed to sing through Cherubini's Requiem. "All right, now we must get through Handel's Oratorio." Julius flipped open a score. A soprano spoke up. "I am to sing the solo." "9, it's me," another lady festered. An alto fought. "My voice is changing. I'm suited for it." As the quarrel began turning into a fistfight, Felix stepped between the ladies to break it up. Yet that only worsened the problem, as they tangled him in the pushing and shoving. Felix finally stepped away and told Julius, "Just leave rehearsals at that for the day." As time pressed on, Felix was wearing himself out physically and mentally. He began escaping music by reading. He preferred books based on fairy tales, so he could feel far away from the reality of life. Lately he had picked up a story by Hans Christian Andersen. It was called The Fair Melusine. It took his imagination into a world of mermaids and love. Though he was trying to take a break from music, the story began to inspire sound. He sketched an outline of an overture. On days at work, the muse of the story consumed his mind. During rehearsal breaks, at the conducting desk, in a carriage, or walking about, he found time to write any sort of melody or harmony fragment. He tried to carry pen and paper at all times. He wrote to his father about his composition. Abraham rather thought it all foolish daydreaming, another overture full of pixies. He wished him to hang up on a nail these dreams on elfin and fairy stories, and work on something graver. The orchestra and theater soon joined together for the classical operas. It only made it harder for Felix to accomplish his creative outlet. But he was excited to move forward with the operas. Being prepared were Der Freischütz, Etchfron, Waterträger, Die Zauberflöte, and Don Juan. There were various plays as well. As a whole, the rehearsals became a torturous affair, with the grumbling members of the orchestra and the drunkards of the chorus. Added to it were actors and set crew working around everyone. Every day there were 2 rehearsals, 10 hours each. After a few hard days, Felix began to show signs of overwork. The 20 hours of rehearsals were killing him. The time spared for sleep rendered useless, as something always kept him awake. His emotions, pressure, or his aching stiff arm from conducting. Herr Immermann noticed Felix walk into rehearsals more and more in a fog. It made him worry, not for Felix, but for the sake of the performances. Immermann called to Felix as he saw him trudging to the conducting desk. "Felix, we must talk." "What do you want?" Felix's tone was rather grouchy. Immermann then channeled his worries. "I have not been able to work as much with the plays, so I need you to take control of regulating the other aspects of opera, such as acting and scenery." "You mean you asked me to do your job?" "If I'm out working with the plays, there will be no one else. It will all go wrong otherwise. I'm off now. I'll check on the progress later. Danke." He left to go work with the actors doing the stage plays. Felix gave a sigh as the orchestra and singers were set up before him, waiting for instruction. It was going to be a long rehearsal. One fine morning, in the 8th hour, a carriage pulled up beside Shadow's home. Karl Klingmann stepped out and breathed in the fair air of Düsseldorf. He was there to see how Felix's first official job was going. After Shadow welcomed him in, Karl went to Felix's door and knocked. "Come in," Felix called. Karl eagerly opened the door, but before taking his coat off, he was horrified at the state of the place. Papers were everywhere, piled, sprawled, or stuffed in folders, some stained with tea or coffee. It consisted of music bills and contracts. Karl turned about, trying not to step on anything. When he came to the dining area, he found Felix at the table, composing as he chewed vigorously at a handkerchief. A cup of coffee sat beside him. He looked as if he'd not slept in days. "Felix?" Carl asked in worry. Felix turned and smiled at seeing his friend. He set his music aside to greet him. Carl was in a state of shock, as this was nothing like his friend. Felix told him, "I'm so happy you've come to visit. I was just about to head to rehearsals. You can accompany me." "All right. Are you fit to go?" "I'll be all right. I must, or Immerman will be upset." He dropped his quill on the table and stood. His outfit was fine, but his hair was a mess. He had some scruff on his chin, and his sideburns were growing out. Klingman lent him a comb. Felix quickly brushed his hair, then headed out the door with Carl following behind. When they arrived at the concert house for rehearsals, Klingman watched from a seat a few rows back. He was baffled at the state of his friend as he conducted. His arm could hardly move high enough for the musicians to see. He looked as if he'd fall over at any given moment. Though the orchestra and singers were coming together well, Felix was falling apart. Immerman walked in during the first act of Der Freischütz and sat next to Carl. Carl had a deep respect for Immerman, as he was a great poet, but he could not get past the fact that he was essentially hurting his friend. Immerman whispered to Carl, "It's all coming together well, is it not?" "I'd say hardly," Carl muttered back. Immerman took offense. "Why, what is wrong?" "Are you blind? Look at the conductor. The opera is coming together, but he is in shambles. If you do not give him a few days' break, I shall find a way to stop the opera's production." Carl spoke in the utmost threatening tone. Immerman huffed. "All right, 3 days he gets. I shall cut rehearsals short today." Immerman stood and headed towards the front. He tapped on Felix. Carl felt much happiness at seeing the relief on his friend's face as Immerman spoke to him. By December, after rest, spending time with Carl, continuing rehearsals and finding success in performing these classical operas, the final opera of the season was Don Juan. Immerman, in a rather foolish sense, raised ticket prices since the other operas were popular. The public thought it an arrogant move. The whole ordeal caused 3 days of scandalous gossip. Members of the company that had doubts ran away, including 2 members of the orchestra. Despite the price complaints, the auditorium sold out. When the hour of the performance struck, the members of the orchestra were set and waiting. Backstage, behind the curtain, a few actors scurried about to their places. Once they settled, Immerman instructed Felix, "Time to go." Felix nodded and entered the orchestra pit. The audience continued muttering and whispering, which wasn't common. The musicians were ready, so Felix counted them into the overture. It was a bit awkward as some spectators decided to raise their voices in conversation. After the completion of the overture, the auditorium echoed with a humble applause as the curtain rose. The singers entered for the first duet, but they had a hard time pursuing as the restless audience gave way to howling and whistling. Felix tapped his baton against the conducting desk to control the veering heads of the orchestra. When the disturbances grew louder than the music, Immerman came to the side of the stage and gestured for the curtain to be lowered. The opera was on hold until things quieted. When they did calm down, the curtain rose again. Shouts started up soon after, drowning out the first act. In the next interlude, a young man in the crowd spotted Immerman standing to the side and threw a newspaper at him. It caused Immerman to go off in a huff. The curtain lowered again. Felix wanted to put his baton down right then and there. It felt embarrassing as the audience behind him complained. The musicians gave sweats of nervousness. Felix held his baton up again. "All right, men, we shall have to trudge on." As Felix gave the next counts, a loud bang echoed through the concert hall. Felix jumped, tossing his baton. He caught it and quickly counted in. The musicians followed, but jolted as another bang echoed. This time a bright spark ignited next to Felix. He nearly fell off the conducting pedestal in fright. Glancing behind him, the insolent young man causing most of the antics waved. He then lit a firecracker and chucked it at the orchestra pit. It landed at Felix's feet, but it was a dud. Immerman came back to the side of the stage as Felix set his baton down, deeming it unsafe to perform. The voices became hoarse and shouting. Immerman could not afford to let this concert go, so he snapped at Felix in a whisper, "Keep going." Felix sighed as he took the baton once more. The orchestra and singers were especially nervous, but Felix called to them with encouragement. As they pursued on, yells continued and firecrackers were tossed, smoking up the auditorium. Thankfully, no one got hurt. At the end, the performance received some claps from loyal audience members. When the curtain gave the final drop, Immerman and Felix called for every performer backstage to speak with them. No one listened. Instead, the actors and musicians shouted at them like fiery rain. "What are we to do?" Immerman consorted with Felix. Felix crossed his arms. "I am not conducting again till the theater committee gives an apology. Why didn't you stop the performance? I could have gotten hurt if that man were firing a gun. The show must go on. I've sold the tickets for tomorrow evening." "You will be conducting," Immerman hissed. Felix turned away. "I refuse." "You are. The orchestra will refuse to play if you don't conduct. They've grown fond of you, as they sound better than before. Now go home, get rest, and be back." Immerman snubbed. Felix headed for the halls to leave, but turned back as crowds of the audience lingered about. He exited through an alley door instead. It was a quiet night as a soft snow fell. Carriages were stationed at the nearby street, so Felix headed that way. As he walked, someone came up beside him. They put their arm around his shoulder, speaking in utmost cheer. "My dear sir, I thank you." It was the young man who had caused the riot. "My name shall be in every paper." He sprinted off before Felix could confront the tyrant. The next day, Felix awoke, got dressed, and made a decent breakfast for himself. He didn't want to think about what was to come for the evening's performance. Shadow knocked at Felix's door, coming in with the morning paper. He informed, "You may want to read this." Felix took the paper, and the headline said it all. It was full of gossip from the night before. Everyone who took part in the tumult was scolded. The instigator of the riot justified himself, declaring that in spite of it all, he had great enjoyment, being especially grateful to Felix for a fun concert. The Association for the Promotion of Music issued a manifesto, denouncing the ordeal so the next concert could go on. But the theatrical committee warned that if the slightest disturbance occurred, it was done. Immerman sent a note this morning. Shadow handed it to Felix. "He had come down with a fever and won't make it tonight." "Oh, how convenient," Felix grumbled. Shadow suggested, "Why don't you go into the market this morning? There is to be a fair today. Get yourself a treat. There will be many baked goods. Take a break and do something for yourself." "All right," Felix grabbed his satchel and headed out. The closer he walked to the market, the more people there were, drinking and dancing about, getting tipsy in the street, as if not the case every day. The smell of fresh baked goods filled the air. Nearby, a group of people crowded around a newsstand, catching the opera drama whilst eating cakes. Felix laid low and bought a cherry tart for himself. When evening came, the preparation of the opera rendered a mess, as a few other council members had decided they were ill along with Immerman. Felix was left to organize both the orchestra and actors himself. He felt a sense of dread when the hour of showtime came. Thankfully, everyone cooperated. Felix took his place at the music desk before the orchestra. The audience received him with good applause. A flourish from the trumpets blared to boost his confidence. Felix counted into the overture with the audience, amid a row, quiet as mice. This time the opera went perfectly. Everyone played and sang with confidence. At the final, the last chord echoed through the auditorium, followed by an unforgettable silence. The crowd burst into applause and cheer. Felix turned and bowed, then let the orchestra stand. The feeling of the concert left everyone joyful. Immerman was missing out. Some singers eagerly came to Felix as he packed up his score. A tenor warmly shook his hand. "Felix, we want to admit to you, before tonight, we honestly didn't like you, nor these classical performances." Oh, Felix didn't know how to answer that statement. An alto then finished the speech. "After this grand concert, we are impatient for another, and we would go to the death for you." They all hugged him. Felix gave a sigh of relief, as the day had been worth the while. After the crowd made their leave, the musicians gathered in a nearby tavern to celebrate. Champagne and expensive cheeses were served. Felix ordered chocolate for himself, as he didn't feel like drinking the night away. He felt calm for once in Düsseldorf. Though the successful opera season ended, the stress of the next work week did not cease. Irritability strung up among the musicians, as Felix decided the orchestra should perform the classic works of Beethoven. As they worked at Beethoven's Egmont, the orchestra began to blabber to one another as Felix conducted in 6/8 time. The murmuring distracted Felix's attention. He glared at the ignorant tyrants. During the air, "Glücklich allen ist die Stille, die lebt," voices spoke over the music. Felix, in a fit of rage, grabbed his score and tore it in two. As soon as he did, the orchestra's playing magically became more expressive. The rest of the rehearsal went more pleasing. Outside of his directing duties, the months after the opera season gave him time to work on his own compositions. He completed the overture to the fair Melusine. Ignaz adored the work when Felix sent a copy. Abraham still wished his son to work on more serious things rather than tales of mermaids. His ideals leaned towards the completion of the St. Paul oratorio. Felix continued working at it, writing to his father that it would be complete in due time. In other aspects, Felix found much more time for secular activities, such as slate parties and balls. His love of dance made it impossible to resist going to at least a few. Other days of leisure were spent with friends, many of which were painters. They were devoid of the slightest arrogance or envy and lived together in true friendship. The circle included Hildebrandt, Benman, and tall, quiet Lessing. They helped him get back into practicing watercolors. Another local artist hosted lessons on Sundays, so Felix joined to brush up. Another project Felix happened upon was giving piano lessons to a young girl who begged him to teach her. Felix made time. He only taught a few selective people, as he was busy otherwise. The girl was the daughter of a manufacturer and had a prettiness to her. Yet in a matter of a few weeks, the girl's family was to move away. On her departure, Felix gave her copies of Mozart and Beethoven. The day after, Felix was surprised to receive a package from the postman. He opened it to find a parasol of fine black cloth to make an entire suit. It was from the girl's father. On a stroll along the grasslands with his friend Lessing, who was riding a horse, Felix showed him the cloth he had received. Lessing hopped down from his horse and looked at the cloth. "You'll have an excellent outfit with such fabric, such luck. I'm quite excited. It was unexpected, but I'm grateful as I needed a new suit." Felix jumped a bit. He then said, "Your new horse has a good temper. That's luck of its own." "Yeah, he is a good companion," Lessing patted the horse. "I do strongly suggest you get one. It's a useful purchase. The countryside is a must to ride out to, so peaceful." "I shall pen a letter to my father. I'd like to consult him on the idea," Felix stated as Lessing climbed back onto his horse and carried on in the utmost leisure. Within the week, Felix had the black fabric made into a most fashionable suit. He also figured out how to tie the cravat Ignaz had given him. It saved much time. After consulting and receiving consent from Abraham, Felix bought a nice bay horse, a good-tempered steed. It became his most favorite acquaintance. On a good day, adorned in his new outfit, he rode along the countryside. Passerby asked if his cravat was English, in which he gave a happy reply that it was. Often Felix took his horse to a lovely spot where the apples grew and flocks of sheep could be visible in the distant hills. Other days he headed to Rodor, as it was a common spot for swimming and bathing. Close to the shore, with the tall grass and stones, the clean water was chin-deep and a little stream flowed. It gave all the more calmness. Felix learned that his horse had a shyness of new terrain, so it had to be encouraged much. On one trot, a storm happened to form. Every flash and sound made the horse start violently. Felix managed to keep control and guide it home, but he felt quite sorry for the creature. In his laziness with heavy storms, he found no inspiration for composition. He worked at his oratorio some, but in truth, not much progress was being made. It vexed him that he was in a state of relaxation, but he enjoyed every bit of it. Felix's world of work slowly began creeping up on him again as Herr Immermann requested he attend more of the theater's meetings. Felix was tired of complying to Immermann's wishes and only wanted to be a friend of the theater, not a main vessel. There was much more important business as Felix joined alongside Julius in preparing the orchestra and choir for a performance of Handel's oratorio Deborah. As Felix sat in one of the boxes of the concert house during a rehearsal, some men entered, taking seats beside him. He didn't take note of them until one spoke up. "I love the way Handel composes." Felix turned his head straightway to see Ferdinand Hiller and Frederick Chopin next to him. He burst with joy. "Hiller, Chopin." "Felix," Herr Hiller hugged him in greeting. Chopin gave the same greet as well. Felix's voice carried across the auditorium as he spoke. "I missed you both ever so. We shall lunch together, shall we not?" "Of course," Hiller kept his voice low, trying to calm Felix's tone. Felix instantly quieted, noticing a few singers looking up from the stage in annoyance. The three then went off for lunch. Felix felt ever so joyous to catch up with his friends of Paris. They ate at the best restaurant in Düsseldorf. That evening they returned to the concert house, as the performance of the oratorio happened to be then. Julius was to conduct, so Felix joined his friends in renting a private box. It yielded much fun as they drank champagne, whispered, and watched. Felix woke at a decent timing in the dawn. He had a few early hours to himself until the 9th hour, when there was a knock at his door. He answered, and it, of course, was Hiller and Chopin. They didn't want to waste any time on their visit. Felix eagerly showed them around. Chopin commented as he looked about, "You have such a fine taste in decor." "Danke, I desire to make any house I live in a home." Felix straightened a hanging painting. It was one of his watercolors. Chopin stood in deep thought, studying such art. Hiller ventured to the fine piano and began playing new material. Felix joined beside to listen. Fernand spoke of his upcoming projects as he continued a tune. The grand ideas gave Felix much anticipation. Hiller then called to Chopin, "You must show Felix your new works." "Well, they are still in progress." Chopin shied away some. Felix encouraged, "Even if it's nothing complete, I'd still like to hear it." "All right," Chopin sat down. He thumbed the soft floral piece to warm up, then gradually went into a newly composed work. Felix stood astonished at the technique of his playing. It was a new piece, with new techniques. He produced effects at the keys much in the same aspect Paganini did with the violin. At the end of the piece, Felix clapped and jumped. Hiller had to take him by the shoulders to keep his feet on the ground. Chopin blushed at the enthusiasm. Felix listened more as both Chopin and Hiller shared all of their ideas. It was all impressive, but some ideas seemed overly influenced by the music scene of Paris. Rather losing sight of sobriety and true music, Felix came to the conclusion that maybe he did too little in finding something new. He shook off his complicated thoughts, determining, all in all, that the three of them learned and improved each other. The next day, Felix felt a terrible sense of irritation. He was to conduct a rescheduled festival, which would take up 2 days of his time. It was out of town, so he would be parted from his friends. As he grabbed his luggage to leave, Hiller assured, "Chopin and I plan to stay a while. We will still be here when you return." "Oh, good. I hope this to be a quick engagement." Felix waved in farewell to Chopin and Hiller as the carriage departed for an 11-hour trip. Only a few hours in, Felix became impatient and cross. It lasted all the way to Aix-la-Chapelle. As soon as arriving, he went straight into the orchestra pit. The festival went decently, but Felix couldn't wait to get back to Düsseldorf. 11 more tiring hours in a carriage required much patience. Felix had none, making it a torture to the coachman. When returning to Düsseldorf, the carriage pulled up to Chateau's home in the sunny afternoon. Chateau happened to be exiting the front door with Chopin and Hiller. When seeing Felix hop out of the carriage, Chateau mentioned, "Ah, Felix, we were going for a stroll if you want to join." "Of course. I'll get my bags inside first." He took his luggage from the coach. After settling it in his room, he came back to the group. They walked down the road towards the gardens. Chopin and Hiller enjoyed Chateau's company, as the older man was dignified, easy-mannered, and had a teacher-like sense to him. He had many words of wisdom to the three young musicians. Hiller then mentioned, "Chopin and I decided to go to Cologne tomorrow. We shall take a steamer, ride out on some post horses, then head back to Paris by carriage." "You're leaving so soon?" Felix questioned somberly. "I must at least accompany you to Cologne." Chateau looked to Felix with sternness. "What of your oratorio that needs finishing? Your father wishes it done." "It will be ready in good time," Felix replied quietly, but with firmness. Their walk ended with coffee and a game at bowls. The evening was spent at Chateau's home, joined with the artists Hildebrandt, Lessing, and Bendman. It was all fun in good manner. They drank and played cards in the main hall. Chopin was reserved the entire time. He spoke in all softness, only sticking to Hiller and Felix, as he was shy of the others. The painters took little notice of him. Hiller sat next to Chopin on the sofa as the others started a chess game. He asked Frederick quietly, "Why don't you speak more? You'd have a much better time." Chopin nodded humbly but didn't answer. Hiller encouraged further. "Frederick, have you anything to talk about?" Not really." He didn't like the group suddenly staring at him. Felix broke the awkward silence by inviting, "Please, play us some piano." "Oh, I don't know." "Please," Felix took his arm, pulling him from the sofa. He guided Chopin to the piano. Everyone circled around to Frederick's dismay. After much convincing, Felix finally stated, "Just close your eyes and play." Frederick shut his eyes tight and played whatever came to his heart. After a solid interlude of music, he opened his eyes to see every face smiling at him. The painters made many comments, adoring his music. Shadow especially found much interest. Chopin finally felt at home with the group and expressed his true self in happy speech. He ended up talking the most by the evening's end. The next morning, Felix, Hiller, and Chopin were on a steamer headed for Cologne. The ride was smooth all the way there, as they laughed and spoke. The moment was one wished to never end. But the boat soon docked, and they took post horses towards Cologne. Felix couldn't stay long with them, as Shadow strongly suggested he work on the oratorio, but he planned to ride to the city with them. In the outskirts, they reached a church and bridge. Hiller parked his horse and dismantled to look at the sparkling water. The day was warm and perfect. He made a remark to himself in extravagance. Such a lovely, unforgettable scene. "Hiller getting sentimental, heaven help us," Felix called, turning his horse around. "Adieu, farewell." With that he departed the company of Chopin and Hiller. Felix journeyed home in his lonesome. When returning to his rooms, there was a note sitting on the dining table. Felix picked it up. The light and pretty handwriting appeared to be that of a woman's. It contained poetry alluding to the fact that he should find a wife. Felix chuckled a bit. He then went to the piano and put together a little tune, deeming it a bachelor's song. As Felix had no means of repaying the orchestra for testing out his overture to the fair Melusine, which wasn't popular among them, he decided to host a dinner at the Academy of roaster veal with bread and butter. Wine as well to let them get tipsy. Felix didn't take pleasure in doing so, but they needed fun sometimes. At the dinner, Felix gave speeches and the musicians had a grand time. Some trumpeters and trombonists brought their instruments, giving a flourishing fanfare. Felix played the bachelor's song at the piano, but no one knew the meaning. Felix's time in Düsseldorf from then on became taxing with annoyance. After setting the dining table with coffee, a pen, and music, he began serious work on the oratorio to have it complete in due time. When finishing a bar, the bell rang. He got up to answer, finding a choir boy grumbling about his music. Felix took care of the matter, then went back to composing. He penned another bar. The bell rang. He got up. Singers and seedy musicians were at his door, needing lessons on their parts. Felix took care of their matters, snubbing at them in the process. Once matters were solved, Felix sat back down. He penned another bar. The bell rang. He got up. Felix opened a door in utter provoke, making a postman jump in a spook. Felix calmed as the postman handed him a letter. He opened it to find a note from Immermann, demanding him to the theater. Felix straightway grabbed his coat to go out. There was reasoning behind his willingness. When Felix arrived at the Spielhaus, Immermann greeted him in surprise. "It's nice that you are finally willing to come to the theater rehearsals. For a while, I almost forgot that you were a member of the theater society." "I came to give my resignation." Felix handed Immermann a contract. "As much as I care about the theater, I quit." Felix kept his speech in all politeness. Immermann pressed his lips together viciously in anger as if he feigned to eat him. When Felix finished speaking, there was a silence. Immermann glared a while, then managed to say, "I guess you may resign, but I will only let you go under one condition, that you promise to occasionally conduct. I cannot fully let you go." "All right, I promise," Felix spoke with ease. Immermann then went away in irritation. Felix felt like a fish thrown back into the water. He nearly skipped all the way home, as he was proud of standing up for himself. When he returned to his rooms, he sat at the table with the oratorio score and managed to get much done, not disturbed once. It seemed as if the clouds had lifted. The freeness of the day also gave him time to read and catch up on letters. One letter had much importance. It was an offer from an acquaintance by the name of Herr Schleintitz. He wanted Felix to come to the city of Leipzig, as there was bound to be an open position with the orchestra. It was the new year of 1835, and Felix's contract with Düsseldorf was to expire the next fall. The idea of staying in Düsseldorf grew grim as his favors veered towards Leipzig. Publishers there were interested in his music. Briekhoff and Hartel wanted to publish anything he had to offer. The first step in escaping Düsseldorf was complete by resigning from the theater. Abraham learned of Felix's actions. Straightway he wrote a scorning letter to his son. It reached Felix's hands days later. It read, "My son, I must once more resume the subject of the dramatic career, as I feel very anxious about it on your account. You have not, according to my judgment, either in a productive or administrative point of view, had sufficient experience to decide with certainty that your distinction towards it proceeds from anything innate in your talent or character. I know no dramatic composer except Beethoven, in which you have made only one public effort, which was partly frustrated by the text and was neither very successful nor the reverse. With regards to the administrative career, it gives rise to another series of reflections which I wish to impress on you. Those who have the opportunity to become more acquainted to you, and those who you desire to express more fully, cannot fail to love and respect you. But this is far from sufficient to enable a man to enter life with active efficiency. When you advance in years, both others and yourself are much more likely to lead to isolation and misanthropy." The letter went on and on. In short, Abraham approved of Felix's resignation, but not in the manner in which he did. As the month of January pushed on, more letters came up upon the subject of Leipzig. Herr Schleinitz wrote up the terms. A good salary, better than his current one, was offered. There was also a plan to host a benefit concert, to ensure a decent bonus. Felix felt such a thing improper and unnecessary. He had much suspicion on the 6 months of vacation time. A lot can come together for an orchestra in such time. Being away 6 months could suffer any progress. On the other side of things, Felix received another letter from Abraham. He and his father began frequently writing back and forth. Though at times they bickered, their relationship had grown strong since visiting London together. A conversation in writing went as so. Berlin, March 10th, 1835. My dear son, this is the third letter I have written to you this week, and if this goes on, reading my letters will become a standing article in the distribution of the budget of your time. But you must blame yourself for this, as you spoil me with your praise. I at once pass to the musical portion of your last letter. Your aphorism that every room in which Sebastian Bach is sung is transformed into a church, I consider particularly appropriate, and when I once heard the last movement of the piece in question, it made a similar impression on myself. But I own I cannot overcome my dislike to figured chorales in general, because I cannot understand the fundamental ideal in which they are based, especially where the contending parts are maintained in an equal balance of power. At Fanny's last morning music, the motet of Bach, Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, and your Ave Maria were sung by selected voices. A long passage in the middle of the latter, as well as the end also, appeared to me too learned and intricate to accord with the simple piety. It is undoubted a fact that without Sutter, your own musical tendencies would have been of a totally different nature. Abraham. Düsseldorf, March 23rd, 1835. Dear Father, I still have yet to thank you for your last letter and my Ave. I often cannot understand how it is possible to have so acute a judgment with regards to music without being yourself technically musical. I thank you 1,000 times for this, and also your opinion of Bach. It pleases me to see your definite sense of music. A knock at the door interrupted Felix. He set the pen down with a sigh, wondering what needy musician wanted him now. When answering the door, he was toppled by an unexpected hug. Leah had come in surprise to visit her son. Felix cheered and hugged back. His mother released her hug, but held him at the shoulders, telling him in all joy, "My boy is living on his own. Oh, I am so proud." "Love you, Mother." Felix felt a cured homesickness. He let Leah into his home. After she observed her first impressions, they went to the living area where Felix set a tray of tea. While sipping some fresh green tea, they caught up. Felix informed her of his current situation. "I am quite inclined to quit my position with the Düsseldorf Orchestra. My contract ends in October. I am wanted in Leipzig, as they offered terms better than what I have now." "I think that would be a good move. They must want you there badly." Leah seemed intrigued. Felix explained further. "Some terms seem too good. I'm going to write to persuade them not to hold a benefit concert for my sake. I hope they are not trying to replace or hurt the job of someone by hiring me." Felix then changed the subject. Would you like something to eat? You've probably been on the road for hours on end. I'm starving. The tea is well, but I do need food. She reclined on the couch to take a nap. Felix went to the kitchen and kindled the stove. There was a Cornish hen hanging in the food pantry. He bought it from the local market recently, so it was fresh. Since the hen was small, he chose to cook some various vegetables such as carrots, radishes, and acorn squash to make it a more shareable meal. Also in the pantry there were many spices to add flavor. He grabbed rosemary and a nutmeg. There was no butter, as he despised it. While the stove heated, he put the hen in a cast-iron cooking vessel, along with the vegetables. He then set a bundle of fresh rosemary beside the meat. Lastly, he grated much nutmeg over it to get the desired taste. Cooking was usually done by a servant, but Felix wanted to do something special for his mother. He deemed himself capable, as he was a man of many skills. After getting the vessel in the oven to roast, Leah couldn't help but sit at the dining table, the air filled with the scent of savory chicken. Felix gave Leah and himself a plate. As he placed the silverware, he mentioned, "For dessert I have lemon curd and biscuits on hand." "So sweet of you," Leah smiled while her son fetched the finished chicken. He came back with a platter of a picturesque meal. They both admired the food before digging in. The waiting didn't last long, as their appetite was greater than their patience. It was a most lovely evening spent together. The next morning, Felix awoke feeling rather out of sorts. He got out of bed to get dressed for the day, hoping a fresh outfit would help. As he buttoned his waistcoat, he paced about the room, feeling ill in the gut. In debating whether he was going to puke or not, the ache seemed to settle in the moment. Yet in the room next door, he heard his mother violently barfing. The sound of it then made him hurl. He felt better, but in haste went to check on Leah. She was in a state of horrid sickness, almost feverish. Felix told her as he helped her back in bed, "I'm calling for a doctor. I think something is wrong with the both of us." He hurried off. Outside the rooms, Shadow found Felix in the halls, in a panic. He stopped the anxious man, asking, "Is everything all right? My mother came down ill this morning. I'm going to get a doctor for her." "Nine, I'll do it. You look sick yourself." Shadow headed out. Felix went back to stay with Leah. Her state put him in a terrible worry. The minute he heard the front door open, he rushed to the doctor that had come. He showed him to the bedroom where Leah stayed. After the doctor tended to her, he informed Felix, "She has a horrible case of food sickness. Her ill state may last a while. When she is able, I suggest accompanying her back home, where she can get comfortable rest and good food." He then handed him a bottle of medicine. "Give her some of this once a day." "I will." Felix's voice weakened a bit as he felt his own wave of ache in his gut. The doctor looked at him. "What did you both eat recently?" "I made chicken yesterday, but it was fresh." Felix felt confused. "Where did you get it?" "Just in the market down the street," Felix stated. The doctor grabbed more medicine and handed it to him. "Don't go there any more. Their meat is bad. I've had many calls under the same circumstance." The doctor took his pay, then left. Felix went back to Leah's room to find her sleeping. Though it wasn't his fault, he felt terrible that he had cooked the hen. In the days to come, Felix decided to use the 3 months' worth of vacation to take care of himself and Leah. He made arrangements to return to Berlin after their illness lifted some. Felix wasn't worried so much of himself, as he seemed better by the next day. Leah, however, recovered slowly. When she was able, they left Düsseldorf the following week. The ride home was long and fearful. Felix had much anxiety for his mother, as the traveling did not help her state. Nothing would be calm until they got back to the safety of home with Abraham. Felix had packed all of his belongings, intending not to return. In the carriage, as Leah slept in the seat across from him, he penned his resignation as music director of Düsseldorf. He had better engagements in Leipzig.